This is the last in our long series of Naturalist Journeys programs. I think this is our 25th year of Naturalist Journeys since the Nature Center's begun. This is our first year of doing it online, and it's allowed us to do lots of awesome things like invite speakers that we normally wouldn't be able to drag all the way over to Montpelier, and also welcome folks from all over the country and all over the world in our audience as well. So thank you all for being here. As we get going here, feel free, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to send a message to me in the chat bar. And we'll hold most of the questions until the end. But if there's any kind of little logistical questions or anything like that, I'll just respond right back to you in the chat bar. So we can use the chat bar to communicate with one another. I want to, and before I turn things over to Dr. Laurel Symes here, I just want to say a big thank you to all of our Naturalist Journeys sponsors for making this possible. I want to thank Hunger Mountain Co-op, thanks to Onion River Outdoors, and also Union Mutual, Capital Copy, and GreenVest. So thanks to them for making this possible. This presentation will be available on our website for a while at least after tonight. So northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations if you want to tune back into this for an encore. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Laurel Symes. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome virtually to Montpelier.
It's a pleasure to be here tonight. You're hearing me, John? All right. Thank you all so much for taking the time this evening to sit down and talk about bioacoustics. I will be starting tonight. This will be sort of a general overview talk where we'll touch on some of my favorite examples from different realms of the animal kingdom. But before I start, I'm going to dive in sort of an unusual way for a science talk. I'm going to ask you to think of something that you find beautiful. So just take a minute. What inspires you? What do you find beautiful? And if we were all sitting in the same room, I'd start asking different people for examples. And people mention rainbows or pieces of artwork, the sight of the sunrise in the morning, sunsets, ocean, lots of different things. But one of the things that's really striking about this is how many of these examples are things that we look at. So for people, sight is incredibly important. But for a lot of animals, sound is one of the most important senses. So tonight we're going to go on a bit of a walk through different animals and how they make sound, why they make sound, and some of my favorite unusual examples of this. So one of the things that all these animals have in common is that they make and use sound, whether it's insects calling for mates, or birds singing in dawn chorus to defend territories, or we're just beginning to learn about the sounds that fish make. There's an incredible diversity of sounds that animals can produce. Here's one of my favorites. What do you think this is? Sound of water and bubbles. But actually the animal that makes this sound is this seal. So if you could stick your head under the ice, the ocean is just full of this sort of sound made by seals defending their territories. They each have a hole where they come up for air, but they will dive under the water and produce these amazing, super diverse sounds. So some of the things that I will touch on tonight is why animals make sound. You know, it's sort of risky. It shows where you are and what you're doing. Why take that risk? And why do different animals make different sounds? How are animals making these sounds? How do animals hear sounds? And then from a research perspective, how can we use sound to understand natural environments and work toward conservation and understanding species interactions? So starting with why animals make sound. Again, this might seem like an unusual candidate for making sound, but this is a southern pine beetle. So these are little tiny beetles. They're about the size of a grain of rice. So this is one here, this is one in flight, and this is the sound that they make. Chirp, 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 chirp. But to hear this sound, you'd actually have to be inside of a tree. So they're producing this sound, not when they're flying around, but when they're living under the bark of trees. And why would they do this? Well, understanding why they're making sound requires understanding something about their biology. So a lot of people know southern pine beetle better from these large beetle kills. And unlike the mountain pine beetle in Colorado and areas out west that's devastating huge areas, these tend to be medium-sized infestations, but they will attack lots of trees and cause localized tree death. And so this is a natural part of the ecosystem. It's been happening for a long time, but as we've changed fire regimes and logging, we see larger and more common, these are called beetle spots. And so what are these beetles doing? You have these little tiny beetles that are the size of a grain of rice, and they're killing acres and acres of forest. So in order to succeed, these beetles need other beetles. If one beetle attacks a pine tree, the pine tree produces sap and it's called pitching out the beetle. The beetle gets stuck in all the sap that the tree can produce and the tree wins. But if you have 10,000 beetles or 50,000 beetles, the tree just can't keep up. And so in order for these beetles to successfully attack trees, it takes large numbers of them. And then they can hop from tree to tree to tree to tree following pheromone plumes. But you can imagine if there are 50,000 of you or 100,000 living inside of the same tree, space gets a little tight. You start to be a little constrained for elbow room. And it's no good for anybody if you're all piled on top of each other. And so there's a little bit of competition that goes on under the tree. So or inside the tree, under the bark. So if you took the bark off the tree, you'd see these amazing little tunnels. And these are tunnels that are created by females, and they're laying eggs along these tunnels as they go. Now, it's in each female's best interest not to be too close to another female. Because if you're laying an egg here and somebody else is laying an egg really nearby, then those two larvae are going to be competing for the same food and probably neither one survives. It's far better if you can find a spot where there's not as much going on. And so by making these sounds, the females are essentially elbowing each other around, finding spaces that aren't as occupied by other beetles. But there are other animals that are making sound and using it in interesting ways. So this is an example of a more familiar sound. This is what's produced by a cardinal. So I'm going to play this sound, and as I play it, you'll see a bar move across this image. So you'll be seeing an image of the sound as you hear it. So this is time here along the x-axis. It's sort of like reading a book where you can read from left to right and then watch the shape of the sound as it happens. And so the higher the sound is on this y-axis, the higher pitch it is. So these are low pitch sounds down here. These are high pitch sounds up here, and the brighter it is, the louder it is. So you can read it across like a book looking for low and high and loud and quiet. So here's our cardinal. So I work at the Lab of Ornithology. People assume that I know bird calls really well. I actually have mostly studied insects and frogs and things like that, but this has been a great tool for me for learning what bird calls sound like, because when I can see them and I can hear them, it becomes a lot easier to understand what's common in different species, or what's common in different individuals of the same species. We can also slow this sound down a little bit so that it's easier to match the sound to the image. One note about being on Zoom, sometimes there's a lag between when you're hearing the sound and seeing the sound. So if you are seeing the scroll bar someplace that doesn't match what you're hearing, I apologize for that. Sort of keep account of how many sound events you see and how many you appear, and imagine those things happening at the same time if you do experience that. So these are birds that are using sound to let others know that they're in a spot defending a territory and potentially to attract mates. But there are some really unusual examples of how birds are using sound also. So these are red-backed fairy wrens, which is a species that occurs in Australia. And you can see they're these teeny tiny little birds, and they're just absolutely beautiful. They're bright colored. They do all sorts of neat courtship behaviors, and they build these enclosed nests with these little tiny eggs. But they have a problem, and that problem is a cuckoo. And so this cuckoo, given a chance, will go to this teeny tiny little nest and lay a cuckoo egg. And when that egg hatches, out comes a baby cuckoo that's going to try to convince the parent fairy wrens to feed it and grow large and take resources and food from the baby fairy wrens. And so obviously for the fairy wrens, this is an awful situation. But if you were to listen inside of this nest as the female and male are sitting on the eggs, you'd hear something sort of surprising. You'd hear these little twitters of sound coming from the adult. And when these eggs hatch, the young produce the same individual signature that was sung to them by the adult. So they're actually learning a particular sound while they're in the egg that serves as an acoustic passcode that says to the adult, I'm actually your baby. And this is something that the cuckoo has not evolved to be able to produce. And so it allows the mother and father to identify the chicks that are actually theirs and feed those. You can imagine that over time there might be selective pressure for the cuckoos themselves to be able to evolve song learning in an egg. But right now the fairy wrens are ahead, and it's a relatively effective system of recognizing your own young. Animals also use sound to communicate with other members of a group. And this is a classic experiment that tested whether these prairie dogs were actually understanding the information that was conveyed in the sound. So typically in these colonies, for example, if a human walks through, there's a human and there's an alarm call from one of the members of the colony, and the prairie dogs will run to their burrow. And so it might be that that sound is saying there's a human here or a predator, or it might just be that everybody saw the human, or anytime there's an alarm call, they run to the burrow. But an interesting thing to note is that if you take a dog and encourage it to walk through the colony, they don't run to the burrow, they stand alert in place to watch where it's going, and they produce a different sound. And so these researchers wanted to know, is the sound actually giving the identity of the predator, or is it just coincidence? And so they recorded these alarm calls and then played them back to the colony when the predator wasn't there and watched what the members of the colony did. And indeed, they perform the same behavior that they would if that predator was there, which means that they're actually recognizing that sound as indicating that particular predator, which is a really, it's almost like having a name for dog, human. There's something walking through and we all know to do this thing. Animals also use sound just to help themselves. So bats are a classic example of echolocation for navigation, where they will send out super high pitched sounds that are above our hearing range, and these sounds go out through the environment, bounce off things in the environment, such as trees or walls, but also insects that are moving and come back to the bat. So this is neat and is something that you might have heard about before, but one of the neat things that's increasingly recognized is the fact that not only are the bats producing and hearing this sound, but many of the insects also have quite simple ears that allow them to hear the bat echolocation calls and take evasive action. So many species of moths have an ear that has 2 neurons, and when you trigger the more sensitive neuron, the moth flies away. And when you trigger the less sensitive neuron, meaning the bat is right there, the moth will close its wings and dive out of the sky, taking the risk of landing on the ground in order to avoid the bat. So some of the general patterns in why animals are producing sound is to defend territories, to attract mates, to communicate with offspring or other group members, and to navigate, including the production of echolocation. So this is seen in bats, it's also seen in dolphins, and quite frequently underwater. So moving on from why animals make sounds, we turn to why do different animals make different sounds. So here's a really neat example of a sound. This is a blue whale. And these are really low pitch sounds. And if you look at the times here, I actually just played you 5 minutes of sound. What we did was speed it up enough that the sounds come up in pitch and we can hear them. So in the same way that if you remember cassette tapes, if you played a cassette tape fast or any sound fast, instead of sounding like normal speed talking, you sound like Alvin the Chipmunk and you talk very fast and you go up high pitch frequency. We've basically done that to this whale where it was so slow and so low that we would not have been able to hear the sound. So we turn it up, play it faster, and that brings it just up into our hearing range. So these are incredibly slow, incredibly low sounds. And in some species, whales will sing songs that last for hours or even days. And so these are just incredibly cool animals. But thinking about what some of the basic biomechanics of why different animals make different sounds. If I told you that one of these animals went woo, woo, and one of them went, you could probably match the sound to the animal. And so we have sort of an intuitive sense of what types of animals are producing what types of sounds. Larger animals tend to produce lower pitch sounds. Small animals have smaller resonators and generally produce high-pitched sounds. So why do particular species make particular sounds? This is another example of a really neat bird song. This is a bobolink. This is a bird that sounds like it had about 4 cups of coffee before 9 a.m. And if you look at the image of the sound, it looks something like this. And we can slow it down and play it and hear a lot of the complexity that's in the song. Oops. Especially if I click on the right button. So this is exactly the same sound. So all I've done there is slow it down so that it's at 20% of normal speed, and that allows us to hear a lot of the complexity that's in that sound. And so we know from various experiments playing back sounds and modifying sounds that bobolinks are actually processing those different fast syllables and are hearing a lot of that complexity. By comparison, if you take a red-breasted nuthatch and listen to the sound, this is its normal speed. This is what it actually sounds like. Repetitive, slow, very little complexity, very little change in pitch or frequency. And indeed, if you looked at where these two birds live, bobolinks tend to live in really open fields and habitats. red-breasted nuthatches tend to live in deep forest. If you've ever tried to talk in a room, like in a closet that's full of hanging clothes, you get a sense of how much sound is lost when it has to move through things. So if you take a bird that has a really complex song and put it in an environment with a lot of vegetation and things that can block the transmission of that sound, this beautiful just comes out as a complete fuzz. You lose all the fast structure of the syllables. And so it's not a very effective sound if you live in dense forests, but it's really effective if you live in fields. Things like red-breasted nuthatches don't have the option of singing these really fast, complicated songs, but they have something that works pretty well where they live. And long, slow, repetitive, even if you lose some of the detail, you can still tell that there's another nuthatch singing in the distance. This is one of the few graphs that I'll show tonight, but it illustrates how tightly these relationships hold in many cases. So this is a white-crowned sparrow. This is a really neat study because it looks at change in habitat through time. Well, actually, the researchers started by just looking at habitats today. And so they went to habitats that were open and habitats that were really scrubby and dense with vegetation. And they said, what is the lowest pitch sound that the bird produces in its call? And so when it's really dense, they're always using these low pitch sounds. But when it's really open, they use high pitch sounds, they use low pitch sounds. They can basically run the spectrum because any of these sounds work well. But as it gets more and more dense, there's a smaller and smaller range of sounds that work well. You have to be low and you have to be slow. In a follow-up study, these researchers actually tracked habitats as they changed through time. So they had recordings from the 1970s, and they knew what the vegetation had been like. And then they had recordings that were made in the 2010, 2011. And they were able to look at how the habitat changed and how the song of the birds that lived there changed. And so you might wonder, like, is this a genetic change? Are these populations evolving? In this case, this is a bird that learns its song from others. And so if you're living in an environment where you can hear lots of different versions, you can learn lots of different versions. But if you're in an environment where these high-pitched versions get filtered out and degraded and distorted, what's left to learn is these low-pitched versions. And so it appears to be a case of cultural transmission, that as they are learning songs in these environments, when the environments are becoming denser, they're learning low-pitched songs, and when the environments are open, they can learn all sorts of different songs. So some of the general patterns that we see is it's difficult for small animals to produce low-pitched sounds. You're never going to get a human that can effectively produce whale-like sounds that are below human hearing. Animals that communicate in cluttered or noisy environments generally use simple or repeated signals. So for example, frogs that live in stream beds with lots of rushing water and loud noise tend to have either simple repetitive signals and or signals that are much higher in pitch than you would expect for frogs, including things that go up to the ultrasound in some cases, because the water sound tends to be low pitch, and by going high, you can get out of that cluttered noise band. If we were in person, this is where I'd stop and ask if people had questions or follow up. If there are things that come up, please feel free to drop them in the chat to Sean. He can either grab me with questions as we go, or I will happily answer at the end.
We have I think, a pretty good one that relates to what you were just discussing. And I was wondering about the example of the winter wren's song as a counterexample to the idea of complexity in forested environments, because it doesn't get much more complex than a winter wren song.
That's, yeah. For every biological rule, there's about 25 biological exceptions. I wish I had bird colleagues on hand to provide really good answers, but some of it comes down to how close animals tend to be when they interact. So if you're right next to another individual, even if you live in a pretty dense environment, you'll sometimes see birds come together and engage in nearby singing competitions where they'll come to the edge of their territory or they'll sit, just a few feet or few meters apart and sing back and forth at each other. And at that point, it's much more about the song and the vocal performance capacity of the birds and the ability to transmit sound from one territory to a distant territory. To be completely honest, I don't know if that's the case in with that particular species, but that's often where we see exceptions to sound transmission. Quote unquote generalities is when animals are behaving or interacting in a way that affects the distance between them. Are there other questions or related follow-up?
Thanks. Yeah, no, there are a couple other questions, but I think we'll hold them till the end.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to do Q&A at the end here. So how do animals make sound? I'm going to pick a few of my favorite unusual examples here because I think they just don't come up that often. So these are tree crickets, and you can find tree crickets all over North America, but very few people have seen them because they tend to be good at hiding and active at night, and sort of tiny and hard to see. But most of us have heard tree crickets, so they sound something like this. So they're sort of the classic night sound on TV programs and movie soundtracks. If people walk outside at night, often what you hear is chirping tree crickets. But they're producing sound in really cool ways. So they don't have vocal cords. They do this instead. So what he's doing is taking his wings and rubbing them back and forth really quickly. So his head is facing away from us. These are his top wings here, and then these are the wings that he uses to fly that are folded down his back. And so what he's doing is rubbing these two wings together to vibrate the wing membrane, sort of like the head of a drum. With a little bit more detail, this is what's going on here. So these are the wings that are going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And every time he closes them, he's rubbing a bunch of little teeth at the bottom of one wing against a vein on the other. And so depending on the species, there's a different number of teeth here. But if you take a magnifying glass and you look at a cricket wing, if it's a male, you can actually see these little tiny teeth. And so different species, by closing their wings at different rates, produce different sounds. And even in the tree cricket example, where you're hearing chirp, 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 each chirp that we hear is actually a set of 5 to 8 wing closures. And so if you took those and slowed them down, you would hear da-dun, da-da-dun, which would be chirp in real speed. And then a pause, da-dun, da-da-dun, which again we hear as chirp. And so these are incredibly fast signals. Here's an example of 3 species that occur in North America. And these are what we would call continuously calling species. So rather than chirp, 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 they just give the trill that you might hear like coming from oak trees in the late summertime. So this is Acanthus quadripunctatus. Those individual pulses is one wing closure. So you can imagine just how fast these crickets are moving. It took me a while to realize, others knew this, but the 40 pulses per second is not those individual teeth hitting. All of those teeth hit 40 times a second. They're actually closing their wings 40 times a second. So they're incredibly fast, but they're not as fast as Acanthus forbesi, which does it 65 times a second. And then we have Acanthus vericornis, which is 75 to 80 times a second. It just sounds like a buzz. And so we've actually, at this point, exceeded our neural firing rate to be able to resolve the individual pulses of sound. And so we just get this, but the females are able to resolve those differences. And they can successfully find males that are producing the pulse rate that they're seeking. Probably beyond the scope of this talk, but there's really cool neural mechanisms involved where one neuron fires and then there's a delay and it has to, the next pulse that comes in has to match the recovery time of the first neuron so that you get combinations that recognize the right rate. So within this group of crickets, the pulse rates range from 40 to about 80 pulses a second. So super fast. And each pulse is one wing closure. This is one of the few other slightly technical things that I'll show tonight, but I think it's super cool. So one of the questions that comes up, if you have a cricket that pulses 80 times a second and a cricket that pulses 40 times a second, it seems like there should be metabolic differences in what that costs. One of those crickets is making twice as many pulses of sound. So are they actually burning their metabolism twice as fast in order to do this? And you can actually measure the metabolic rate of a cricket or how many calories it takes to make cricket song. And so what you do is you take a cricket and you put it in a little jelly jar and you screw on the lid, and there's enough air in them there for them to be happy for a couple of days. They don't breathe very much. But these little membranes on the top of the jar allow us to take out just a little bit of air and measure how much carbon dioxide is in the jar. And then you let the cricket sing. And so in the same way that when we run, we inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, when a cricket sings, they're using oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. So we can ask, how much carbon dioxide have they made in this jar? And how much have they sung? And so how much is it costing a cricket to sing? And how is that different across species? So this is Acanthus quadripunctatus here. On the x-axis is how much of the night it spent calling. So some of these crickets never called at all. They just hung out that night. It was an off night, Friday night, whatever, Saturday. Some of the crickets called a lot, and then there were things in between. And we could look at how much carbon dioxide they produced. And so even the crickets that didn't sing produced carbon dioxide. So this is their resting metabolic rate. They're still metabolizing sugar. They're still doing cellular repair. So they don't go to zero. But this is sort of what it costs to be a cricket. And then this increase is what it costs to sing. And so we can find the slope of this and calculate the cost of calling. If you do this for a species that calls 40 times a second and the species that calls 80 times a second, we were anticipating that 80 pulses a second would have a much steeper slope where it costs more to call. It turns out that they don't. They trade off between how many teeth they strike and how long the pulses are with how many pulses they're producing. So they either produce a lot of really short pulses with very few teeth or a few really long pulses using lots of teeth. And so they actually are much more similar across species than we might have guessed just from looking at the calling rates. Here are some other animals that produce really cool, unusual sound outputs. These are tree hoppers. So these are true bugs that sit on plants and suck sap, but they sound like this. Or you can find a species that looks like this and sounds like this. Or maybe like this. And if you're wondering why you never heard these sounds, there's a couple answers. One is that these guys are teeny tiny. The other is that they are actually producing these sounds into the stems of plants. So these are not sound waves that travel through air. These are vibrational waves that travel through plant stems. And so another individual of the same species that's standing somewhere else on the plant suddenly feels the plant go, and they can pick up these signals and they can tell what species, is it their own species or is it something else? And they can walk and find each other to mate. Incidentally, some of these species are crop pests, and people are experimenting with producing vibrations in the plants as a way of jamming their communication so that you don't get as many sap-sucking insects on agricultural plants. Grapevines seem to be particularly good because they grow on wires, and so you can vibrate the whole wire and potentially mess with the pests that live on them. Other unique forms of sound production include things like dolphins, where they're producing these high-frequency echolocation clicks, but they're actually using part of their body to focus and direct these sounds. So the high-frequency clicks pass through the melon, or this fat-filled body in the skull of the dolphin, go out and bounce back and provide more directional information and stronger signals. Here's an example of these sorts of sounds. So you can hear just how fast these echolocation clicks go, interspersed with vocalizations. And I initially thought about not talking about birds because, we think quite a bit about birds, and maybe that's the less unusual example, but bird sound is actually just spectacular. So here's an example of a singing bird. This is a wood thrush, which is a spectacular bird song. I'll play that one again. This is sort of a characteristic sound of especially late evening in the forest, or like around sunset. But if we actually slow down this sound and look carefully, there's a couple things going on. So this is one sound, but this is also being produced at the same time. I don't know about you, but I could try a long time and not make a sound that goes down at the same time as a sound that goes up. I think for a second what it would be like to try and do that with your vocal cords. I can go down, I can go up, but these birds are doing both at the same time, which just seems sort of unfair.
Would you be able to turn your computer volume up a little bit and play those again?
Oh,
Those
absolutely.
are a lot quieter than some of the other calls for some
Yeah,
reason.
no problem. So here's the full speed call. Is that any better on your end?
I think it's a little better, yeah.
So now we're going to play just what's in this red box. And then we're going to focus on the other sound that's happening at the same time down here. So this is going up and down, and then this goes up and stays steady. So this is not something that is part of my vocal repertoire. And it's because I don't have the same sort of vocal apparatus that a bird does. If you look at the way that we produce sound, our vocal cord, we have one set of vocal cords. Birds get two, and that gives them lots of options that we just don't have. And so at the exit to each lung, they have a set of sound production mechanisms. And that gives them the ability to produce a sound that's sweeping up at the same time as a sound that's trilling. If you look at birdsong recordings and practice, you'll quickly be able to pick out moments when this is happening. You'll see something that's sweeping up at the same time that you see something that goes up and down, and you know that those have to be two different sound production mechanisms because they're actually going different directions at the same time. So some of the general patterns in sound production is that sound can be produced internally using vocal cords, or externally by rubbing or hitting body parts. And for many organisms, such as frogs and insects, producing sound takes lots of energy. It can be as much as 10 times your resting metabolic rate. So for us, this would be like running, essentially all night long. It's like running a marathon, except you're doing it with sound rather than with your feet. So in the final part of the talk, I'm going to turn to how animals hear sound and how we can use sound to understand biological communities. So hearing sound can be influenced by lots of things, including the environment and the types of noise that are present. Anything that the animal can do to amplify the sound that it's getting at its auditory system, the type of internal processing that's happening. So here is a really cool graphic that was made by somebody in our center looking at communication in whales. So this is Cape Cod, just off of Boston. And each of these light colored spots is a singing whale. And so these harbors are just full of whales. And we can use sound to watch them come and go at different times of year to identify what species are present. But in this case, we also capture what happens when a ship comes into the harbor. So these are the sorts of equipment that we're dropping. We have a 35-foot research vessel, and then these are marine autonomous recording units that are anchored in various spots off the east coast of the US. And we capture long recordings and can use them to localize animal sounds. So here are our individual whales. This is what happens when one commercial ship comes into Boston Harbor. So you can see just how loud these sound sources are and how it affects the communication distance of whales. And so this can really spark some interesting thinking about how to make some of these sound sources quieter. You know, often it's just not even on the radar of people who are engineering ship engines to make them louder or quieter because the sound goes underwater and isn't necessarily obvious to people. And also how to time and group ships coming in. So perhaps you direct traffic in during certain hours of the day and it's just too loud to communicate, but you protect a couple hour quiet window when these animals are still able to produce sound and hear each other. This has been especially useful for setting noise thresholds for things like Glacier Bay that are protected natural areas and also popular cruise destinations. This is just a fun example. This is a hypothesis and not something that's been well tested. But if you look at a moose, what's with these antlers? So they certainly have lots of functions for getting bark off of branches and things like that, but do you really need them this thick? So there's a hypothesis that's, to my knowledge, not been tested, that these are acting essentially as satellite dishes, capturing sound from a large area and then bouncing it to the ears of the moose. So if anybody needs a project sometime, it would be fun to create a model of this and see how much the shape of the antlers does or does not influence sound capture at the ears. And finally, one cool, weird ear example. This is one of my favorite species. This is a tropical katydid. And one of the things that makes it neat is its legs are pink, so you can see this little black spot on its legs. We're looking at a similar structure here. These are its ears. So the ears of crickets and katydids are not on the side of their head like they are for us, but they're actually these little membranes that occur in the front legs. And when sound hits them, the membrane vibrates back and forth, stretches the neurons on either side of it, and sends signals up to the brain of the insect. And ears can often be quite simple. In these crickets, you're looking at relatively few regions of sensitivity, but this is a cricket call down here. This is a bat echolocation call. And so they have one neuron that's responding to the low frequency sounds, and this is often used to find mates and can elicit what's called phonotaxis, or going toward the sound. And if you're playing a high frequency sound and they're flying, that's a bat, that's bad news, and they'll drop out of the sky. And so with just a couple neurons, they're partitioning their acoustic environment. But you can imagine if you're a cricket and your ears are right by the front of your body and you're making these super loud chirps, you're not really hearing anything. How are you hearing other individuals or predators? How do crickets call without just shutting down their ability to hear their own sounds? They can actually turn off their ears each time they produce a sound pulse. So they interrupt the neural activity while they're making noise, integrating just the silent intervals in between. And if you just want to see what cricket ears look like in action, this is a playback experiment. So this is a cricket under the cup. This is a female cricket. And what we're going to do is play a male sound. This is actually a sound that we made to test what she likes. And so we will lift the cup. What we're hearing is the sound of the fake sound of the male cricket. You can see it turning back and forth as she uses the difference between an intensity between her front legs to find the sound, and she walks to the speaker. And so just to give you a sense of how subtle these differences can be, we were creating sounds that varied just a little bit in pulse rate. So this is the sound of a sexy cricket. Females really like this. And this is the sound of an unsexy cricket. Almost none of the females would respond to this. It's a little bit slower. This is not a technical error on my side. Those are actually two different sounds, but it's about 3 pulses per second difference between really sexy and really not sexy. So finally, how can we use sound to understand biological communities? So if you imagine a rainforest like this, it's an incredibly diverse, beautiful environment. It's also really, really hard to know what's there. Maybe you can hike to a few spots, but you're not seeing the canopy. You're not seeing lots of areas. You can at best take some really rough guess of what species occur in this habitat, let alone how many individuals or how populations are changing through time. So one of the things we've been working on is trying to use acoustics to get a better sense of what species occur in these environments and how their populations are changing. And the group I've worked the most with on this sort of work is tropical katydids. So these are cool, big insects that get eaten by birds and bats and geckos and frogs and spiders and all sorts of things. They're basically the popcorn of the rainforest. Anything that can get their hands on them will eat them. And you can see they have all sorts of amazing visual defenses. They look like leaves. They mimic other toxic insects in the environment. They have clear stripes that you can see through, so you can't even see the shape of the insect present. And they can also get pretty big. So you don't have to find that many of these each day to have eaten pretty well. They also eat dozens of plant species and approximately their body weight in leaves every day. So you can imagine having just a few of these in the forest can really start to chew through rainforest leaves, especially because a lot of these leaves live for multiple years. So one of the primary things that eats them is bats. There are more than 80 species of bats in these forests, including at least 4 species that are eavesdroppers. So they're actually listening for the insect sounds and hunting them by those sounds. Here's examples of those bats. You can just see the size of the ears. So they're hanging there listening for these insect sounds, targeting them, and then diving in to grab the insect. And it works. This is what shows up under the roost of some of these sorts of bats. Just for fun, this gives you a sense of what the bat does when it hears a katydid call. So it's hanging there now listening. There's the katydid, there goes the bat. And if you look on the other side, this is a speaker hidden in the pile of leaves. This is the katydid sound. And there comes the bat. So it's sort of a dangerous environment to be a katydid. And so one of the neat things that comes from this is that there are a lot of species that produce little short calls that are unique to that species. And so we get a lot of information without getting the dense pounding insect choruses that we sometimes get in North America. So can we use sound to take the pulse of the community and track changes across seasons, across sites, across time? And so this is an example of what it looks like if you record in these environments. So these are crickets down here, but all of these little short things up here are different species of katydids. So each color of box is a different species of katydid. And you can see they're just part of a second long. They're really short. They don't repeat very often, but it gives a nice snapshot of what's present in that place. So we've been working on a project to use machine learning to identify animal sounds. So in the same way that now you can talk to your phone and it will transcribe what you're saying, we're trying to develop similar approaches for natural environments where we can take sound and transcribe what species are present and what they're doing. So some of the challenges for this is it requires large amounts of data and pretty intense computing resources. And it still has some advantages and limitations compared to people. It can go through far more sound than we can. We recently did a project where we were creating human annotated data, which means that we sat there and identified the species of each of those insect sounds. And we spent about 600 hours going through about 6 hours of recording. A computer ran that same 6 hours of recording in about 5 minutes. And ultimately did as well as we did and better. But in order to evaluate how well the computer did, we had to go through it first. And so I'll touch on this fairly briefly, but for folks who are interested in how this works, we're using something called a neural network, which is basically a computer approach that's modeled on how brains work. And so it takes individual features. So for example, light and dark spots. If you get light next to dark, maybe this neuron fires and passes a signal up through the network. And then if you get constellations of light and dark in the right place, some of these middle neurons will begin to fire. And if you get all the right things in the right places, then you can begin to recognize, in this visual example, things like eyes and faces. As light next to dark next to light in the right pattern might be an eye. I'm happy to talk a lot more about this, probably more than most people want to hear, but it's just neat to see how the neural architecture that's evolved in animals can inspire and be inspired or parallel to computer models that can be really effective for these sorts of tasks. So they're essentially rules that evolve in a computer framework through guess and check processes. And so for the katydids, we start with these examples of their sounds and train one of these models. And it's essentially 100% accurate with new clean recordings. So something that the model has never seen before, but there's no background sound. It's great. And this was both inspiring and disheartening as a biologist. I was working with a computer scientist and he walks into my office and says, "We're 70% accurate." I said, "Oh, that's amazing." He comes back 3 days later, he's like, "We're 90% accurate." I was like, "Wow, that's about as good as I am." And he comes back, a week after that, and he's like, "Yeah, we're 99.8% accurate." It's like, I've been replaced. There are still lots of things that I can do that it can't, but it's incredible how effectively these can process sound. So then the next challenge was to translate it to natural environments where there's actually lots of background sound. And so to get those sort of recordings, you can't just record an insect in a cage, you actually have to go to where the insects are. And so sometimes you plan a project and then later think about the logistics of exactly what that means. So this is us climbing trees in Panama. This is where I was reminded that I'm actually quite afraid of heights, but sometimes you're too far down a path to step off of it. So we went ahead and got our recorders in the trees, and this is what we captured. So you'll first hear the sound at full speed and then slow down so that you can hear those high-pitched sounds that were above our hearing. This is just night in Panama in the rainforest. Slowing down. That's an insect. And that's a bat. you're hearing the individual echolocation calls of the bat as it flies through. So the visual is not nearly as cool as the sound, but conveys so much information. So this is the results of running that model for just one species of katydid. And you can look across seasons with each little vertical line being one night, starting at 7 p.m. and going through to 6 a.m. in the morning. And so the darker the spot is, the more sound is present from that species at that time. And so even if I've been replaced in my ability to identify individual katydid calls, this opens all sorts of new doors for asking why certain species are present in common at certain times of year. This is a species that the first time I saw the output, I thought there was some sort of artifact in the model. It only calls between 4 and 6 in the morning. No, there has to be something wrong. There must have been something going on with the equipment. But actually, we went back to our focal recordings, and indeed, this particular species of katydid calls between 4 and 6 in the morning, and we have no idea why. So there's lots of new, really fun, cool biological questions on the table. And the final thing that we're hoping to do with this is to be able to go from these recordings to estimating how many insects are in the forest, or how many katydids. So we have recordings where we know how often one individual insect calls in 24 hours. And that varies a lot by species. Some of these insects call again and again, and some only call a few times. So here, each vertical line is one individual call. This species calls about 20 times a night. This species calls about 5,000. And we're using these sounds to be able to know how many detections we have of this species, how many times it sings per night, and to take a guess of how many insects are within the listening radius of the recording equipment in different forests, in different seasons, and in different years. So we'll hopefully be able to finally get at the question, are there about the same number every year, or are there some years when there are 10 times as many of some species as there are of others? And so I'll end with this spectrogram recording. This is 24 hours of sound from the field site in Panama, and it just gives a visual of all the different things that go on over the course of a day. So this starts at noon, 6 p.m., midnight, 6 a.m., back to noon. And so here's night. This is all night here. These are all insects calling. But at dawn, we have howler monkeys down here. We have birds called oropendulas. And other types of birds. These will be parrot sounds. So by using a combination of skilled human observers and computational techniques, we're trying to translate these captured acoustic recordings into information that tells us about what species are present and what animals are doing in the environment. So I will stop there. And I'm happy to answer any questions that come up. I don't know if you've been collecting things, Sean, or if I should just turn to the chat. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I got plenty of questions. First of all, thank you very much. And thanks again to all of our sponsors. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. We're just going to be a recording of this up on our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations. So if you really want to stick around for the little Q&A here, but have other things to do, feel free to pop out and we'll keep the Q&A in there at the end of the recording as well. But lots of questions. And so I'm going to throw these at you in not the same order that they arrived, but first and most importantly, Lila is 7 years old, and she wants to know, where does the sound from the bobolink come from?
I don't know where that recording was made. It was made by a friend of mine who lives in Montana, So my guess is that it was something that he either recorded. He's done work in a lot of different places. Unfortunately, I don't know where it was recorded, but it was probably in a real early in the morning in a field someplace would be my guess.
And Lila might be wondering what part of the body it came from too. She might have asked this question right before you got into the
Okay.
experience things.
So sometimes you'll see a bird sitting with its head thrown back and its beak wide open. It's actually producing sound by taking air from its lungs, and then it's sort of similar to us where it's coming out and it's able to project sound out of its beak into the environment.
Thanks. Let's see. So Judy is wondering, do white-crowned sparrows raised in dense habitats where they hear only sounds in that lower register, then only court using songs that they know and therefore are limited to who might be responding to that song?
Yes, that would be my. So I was not the one that did that research, but that would be my understanding from that study, is that that's the set of sounds that that population has to work with. And then if, for example, it becomes more open through time, you'll often see birds experiment, especially young birds. And so things will get added back into the repertoire if they're effective and if other individuals hear them, learn them.
Sandal's wondering, do most animals make a sound for one reason or another? And how common or uncommon is it for an animal just to not make any noise at all?
Yes, the classic silent animal. That it happens. So for example, like we don't know of slug sounds, or at least I don't. Somebody might. But it started, if you'd asked that question years ago, people would have listed off a fairly short list, birds, insects, frogs. And the deeper we dig, the more animals we find that make sound. So fish are one of the really fun frontiers of sound production in animals right now. It's like just about anywhere that you look hard enough for fish and listen carefully enough, you find species that are producing sound. And people have known this at some level for a while. So, for example, there are species called a drum. And if you pull them out of the water, they actually make sound when you do that. But for often the people who are making that observation were preparing to eat them, and not the biologists who are studying fish populations. So as that knowledge has gotten more shared and people have started to understand the behavioral context, we just keep finding animals that make sound.
Let's see. Couple of kind of technical questions. Amy's just wondering, how do you actually go about measuring pulses per second on something like those crickets that are doing 78 pulses per minute?
I
I
spent
mean,
a lot of time
per second, sorry.
measuring pulse rate. So again, the images of sound can be really useful for that. So what we were doing is capturing the recording and then pulling it up in a static image where you can stretch it out and then either just manually sit there and count the number of events in a second, or use some sort of amplitude detector to say there are 75 events that are above this threshold. And then you go through and you check, yes, those are all pulses, and you can measure, over 5 seconds, how many detections were there, and then divide by 5 to get the number of pulses per second. After doing it for quite a while, I got to the point where I could listen to different species and take a guess, plus or minus a few pulses, of what those rates were, but I never got to the point where I was nearly as good as a female cricket. They could lap me every time.
Well, so Kate is commenting that she wants to be your lab assistant, first of all, and asks,
We're always open.
and then is asking, when you're feeding data into your AI, are you actually, is your input the actual audio, or are you putting in graphs of some sort, visuals?
Yeah, so the image recognition has gotten, there are several things that make image recognition easier than audio recognition. So the first step of that process is to take the audio and turn it into one of the spectrogram images, sort of like what we saw for the cardinal and some of the other species, so that then we can feed it into some of the same programs that we use to recognize like pictures of fire hydrants or things like that. so you can build on all of the image recognition tools. But there are some special considerations for audio. You have to pick some settings as you go from a sound to an image, and the way that you pick those can optimize the sound for different species or for different types of application.
Mary is wondering, and there's so many questions coming in. Thank you, everybody. At some point, though, we might have to let Dr. Symes go here, but we'll see how long we can endure before you give up on us.
Animal sounds way longer than any normal person wants to listen to animal sounds.
I think you might have met your match here then, because we could listen to this all day. In fact, somebody's asking if we could listen to a fish sound. I assume they mean the animal, not the band.
Yeah, I don't have any immediately on my computer, but if you go to the Macaulay Library of Sound, there are some nice, I think they have fish examples. Also, if you go to YouTube and search for fish sounds, even some of the aquarium fish make sounds. So I have a couple of colleagues that, rather than having aquaria that are based on what they look like, they have aquaria that are based on what they sound like.
That is really cool.
Drop a hydrophone in your fish tank.
I will, and if the person who was asking that question is still on, when I post the presentation to our website, I'll put a link below to a couple of interesting fish sounds that I come across, just so that it's all there in one place. All right. Mary's wondering, referring to the shape of the wings in the snow crickets, does having the wings in that cup sort of shape increase the volume?
Yes. So one of the challenges of being really small is that, well, it's a challenge for a few things, but you can actually end up canceling out your sound. And in the same way that like sound cancellation headphones will block incoming sounds, it can happen as a non-desirable effect in small animals. So having big wings helps separate the sound that's going forward and backwards. And there's a species in this genus in India that will take that even a step farther by chewing holes in leaves and using it as a baffle. And so they will flip their wings all the way forward and call through the hole in the leaf. Our North American ones don't seem to do that, but still super cool.
Let's see. Wondering about, I think Jean Jacques is wondering about the morphology of those, the bristles on the comb of the, I can't remember the word you're using for it, but the
little teeth in the stridulatory file when they.
Yes, yeah. If just the evolutionary function of those, and if there can be, if that's derived from some other process, referring to, for instance, the mechanism that hooks together the front and rear wings in bees.
Yeah, it almost certainly comes from something else, as so many adaptations do. The actual sound production system in crickets and katydids is super, super old. There was a neat paper recently that reconstructed the sounds, I think it was the Jurassic, Triassic, from fossil crickets by looking at the fossilized structures of the wings. So even millions and millions of years ago, they were using some version of that sound production system. So like we might not know what color dinosaurs were, but we know what sounds they were hearing. Where that initially came from, I can easily imagine it being some other, whether it's part of the wing structure or just the physical firmness of the wing that then gets adapted. I don't know the evolutionary history of it, but it's been around for a long time.
That's super cool. Since we're on the subject of cricket wings, or I guess katydid wings in this case of this question, I'll just read directly what Laurie wrote. Considering the katydids at the very end, is there a studied metabolic cost to the species that vocalized 5,000 times a night versus the species that called only about 20? And if the cost is indeed higher, how does this species account for gaining the extra energy to do so?
Yeah, so tropical, I would love to get, I don't have any energetic measurements of the tropical katydids. We haven't gotten that CO2 system to the tropics to get those measurements. My guess would be that in that particular forest, a lot of the calling costs come from predation as opposed to metabolic costs. So even in the species that are calling 4,000 or 5,000 times a night, one of the amazing things is that those calls are so short that if you take all the sound and add it up and ask, like, how much total sound comes out of this insect in a night? In North America, it might be 3 to 6 hours a night. In Barrow, Colorado Island, the site that we work in Panama, it's ranged from like 2 seconds to 2 minutes per night. It's incredibly sparse. We sit around on the porch and ask each other, like, how do they ever find each other? You get 2 seconds of sound per night in a rainforest with 80 other species of these insects, and somehow the males and females are finding each other. So there could well be metabolic costs that differentiate those species. But my guess would be in that particular case that the costs are mostly imposed by eavesdropping predators. And indeed, the species that sing more, we find more pieces and parts of those species under the bat roosts. And so the costs are real, whether or not they come in terms of calories that you need. But they might be putting those calories in other cool places. So for example, when they mate, the males will give the females a nuptial gift where they basically take and package a bunch of proteins and fats and things like that can be 30 or 40% of their body weight. So it might be, instead of pouring all that energy into making sound, they make just a little bit of sound, but then really incentivize the female to come and find them. So it's totally a weird system, but really a fun one to work with.
Since we're on the subject of the like, how do you find somebody with 2 seconds of sound in a rainforest? I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the calibration of the hearing and the frequencies with which different things can hear. Like, I'm just thinking about, for us, we can hear more frequencies than noises we can make as humans. But I'm wondering if the band of frequencies that various different insects and other orders can hear is much more finely tuned to what they can actually produce. And if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it varies an impressive amount depending on the species. So for example, the crickets that we were looking at are only hearing sound in a few different frequency bands. And so I was working with a radio reporter a few years ago, and we took a symphonic piece of music and filtered it so that you only heard the frequencies that a cricket could hear. Like, what would this sound like to a cricket? And we played it, and we looked at each other and went, oh, it sounds like a cricket. Like, of course we should have seen that coming, but they hear the frequencies that they make, or the pitches. Katydids, on the other hand, they're hearing a surprisingly wide range of sounds. So their ears tend to be the most sensitive in the sounds that are produced by potential mates. And they can hear the echolocation calls of bats. But they're also hearing, at some level, a lot of other sounds. And so that may allow them to hear the sounds of approaching predators, for example. Or we see some interactions between species where they're more likely to call after an individual of another species. And so, like, species A calls and all of a sudden species B calls right afterwards. So it might be that if there's a predator in the area, once somebody has attracted their attention, there's sort of a window of safety after that. And so being able to hear a few different species, even if you're not mating with them, gives you more acoustic context than just zeroing in on your species. So there's a lot of variation across species, just within insects. But then if you factor in, birds, like, a lot of the really low pitch sounds that we hear, birds aren't hearing at all. But there are other animals that are hearing lots of things that we don't. So it always comes as sort of a shock when we realize what a small percentage of the actual acoustic information we're capturing. There's a lot of things that go on above and below that we just don't get.
There's a bunch more questions. I do want to be really mindful of your time because I know you have other things going on this evening. If might just maybe ask one or two more. I'm intentionally holding back some of the questions related to bird natural history and I'm going to direct folks over to the presentation of Don Kreutzma's program.
I
Just a
will
couple of weeks ago, he
definitely
joined us, and
Don.
so if you want to do more pondering about bird noises, that would be a fantastic thing to check out over at our website.
Don knows about 10 times as much about birds as I do.
Let's see. Richard's wondering if you know of any work on ecoacoustics of landscapes in New England.
I know a passing amount about ecoacoustics. So ecoacoustics tends to be even a little bit broader than what we're talking about tonight. So a lot of what we've been doing is finding sounds of individual species. Depending on how the term ecoacoustics is used, it often means using mathematical approaches just to calculate like the complexity of recording. So not identifying particular species, but just saying what percentage of the frequency space or pitch space is used, how much does it go up and down and things like that. I've done less with ecoacoustics because as a biologist, I'm often interested in the individual species and being able to calculate the diversity of species that are present, which is probably related to the diversity of sounds. But like if you put in one cicada in a recording, it can really change the acoustic profile. So I don't have a whole lot to say about the detailed ins and outs of ecoacoustics. I wish we were in the same room to sit back and have a drink afterwards and chat shop. But yeah, there's a lot of cool work being done across that spectrum.
Cool. Well, I think we'll leave it there, and I just want to thank you again so much for sharing your work with us and giving us some really fascinating things to think about.
Do I have the ability? Yeah, I'll drop my email in the text box for everybody. If you have follow-up, I will note that I am, as of earlier this week, on maternity leave, sort of. So give me a couple days if I'm a little slow to respond, but all is well and good here. So
I'd like to further thank you for sharing your wisdom with us shortly after having a child. So that is
sometimes life happens when it happens.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, congratulations, and
thank you all for coming out.
Thank you again.
And
everybody have a lovely rest of your week and fantastic weekend.
Take care.